The sound reaches you before the sight, traveling through the thick African air like distant thunder that never fades, never resolves into silence. You are still kilometers away, walking through the bush where elephants have worn paths between the trees, where the earth is red and the vegetation dense with the green abundance that this latitude provides. But already you can hear it, that deep, sustained roar that has no beginning and no end, that fills the space between heartbeats, that becomes not so much a sound as a presence, a vibration felt in the chest as much as heard by the ears. The sound grows louder with each step closer, gains complexity and texture, reveals itself to be not a single roar, but a symphony of roaring. Water striking rock and water striking water, and air being displaced in massive volumes, all of it combining into a sustained thunder that makes conversation difficult and then impossible, that forces you to communicate in gestures and expressions, that claims the auditory space so completely that all other sounds become irrelevant, drowned beneath the overwhelming voice of the falls. And then the mist appears, rising above the tree line ahead, a column of vapor that climbs hundreds of meters into the sky, catching the sunlight and transforming it into a permanent cloud that hovers above the source, that marks the location of the falls from kilometers away, that the local peoples named Mosi-oa-Tunya, the smoke that thunders, centuries before Europeans arrived and imposed their own nomenclature, their own ways of seeing and naming and claiming. The mist rises like smoke from a vast fire, like steam from the earth's core escaping through a fissure, like something conjured rather than merely physical, something that suggests forces beyond the ordinary, beyond the merely hydraulic. The moisture in the air increases with each step, becomes palpable, becomes a fine rain that soaks through clothing and beads on skin, that makes everything slick and dripping, that transforms the approach to the falls into a passage through water in all its forms, from vapor to mist to rain to the torrents yet unseen but heard and sensed and anticipated. The vegetation responds to this constant moisture with exuberant growth, creates a rainforest in the spray zone where ferns and vines and flowering plants thrive in conditions found nowhere else for hundreds of kilometers, an oasis of moisture in a landscape that is otherwise seasonal, that experiences dry months when rain does not fall and rivers run low. The path leads through this rainforest, through trees draped with moss and epiphytes, through undergrowth that is perpetually wet, that never fully dries even in the driest months because the spray from the falls is constant, because the mist never entirely dissipates, because this place exists in its own microclimate, its own small world of perpetual moisture and relatively stable temperature and conditions that support species found nowhere else on Earth. The light is filtered and softened by the canopy and by the mist itself, creates a diffused illumination that seems to come from all directions at once, that eliminates harsh shadows and makes distances difficult to judge. And then the path emerges from the forest onto the cliff edge, and suddenly the source of all this sound and moisture and presence reveals itself. The Zambezi River, after flowing for more than 2,000 kilometers across southern Africa, after gathering tributaries and crossing floodplains and sustaining ecosystems and human communities along its entire length, reaches a point where the earth simply drops away, where a fissure in the basalt bedrock creates a chasm 108 meters deep and more than a mile wide, and the entire massive river, in flood carrying more than 500 million liters of water per minute, plunges over the edge in a curtain of falling water so vast that the mind struggles to comprehend it, struggles to process the scale and the power and the sheer improbability of this much water in continuous freefall. The view from the cliff edge is obscured by spray, by the mist that rises from the impact zone far below, that climbs in turbulent columns driven by the air displaced by falling water, that creates a rain more intense than most storms, that makes seeing the actual falls a matter of timing and luck and patience, waiting for shifts in wind or brief reductions in volume that might allow a glimpse through the veil of moisture. But even without seeing the falls clearly, without being able to make out the details of water in descent, the sense of what is happening here is overwhelming, is communicated through sound and mist and the vibration in the stone beneath your feet, through the rainbows that form in the spray and the sheer quantity of moisture in the air, and the knowledge that just beyond this curtain of mist, just a few meters away but invisible, one of the greatest waterfalls on earth is engaged in its endless work of falling, of carving, of transforming landscape through the simple persistence of water obeying gravity. The cliff edge is lined with viewpoints, named and designated, each offering a slightly different perspective, a different angle on the falls, a different relationship to the spray and the sound and the abyss. Some are relatively dry, positioned where the prevailing winds carry the mist away, where you can stand in relative comfort and observe the spectacle without being completely drenched. Others are directly in the spray zone, require waterproof clothing or a willingness to be soaked, offer more intimate encounters with the fall's power, but at the cost of visibility and comfort. Moving between these viewpoints, traversing the cliff edge paths, you experience the falls not as a single phenomenon, but as a series of encounters, each revealing different aspects, different qualities, different elements of the complex interaction between water and rock and air that creates this place. The fear is real, visceral, a recognition that you are standing at the edge of a drop that would kill you instantly if you fell, that the barrier between you and that fall is often nothing more than a low wall or a chain-link fence, or sometimes just your own judgment and balance, that one misstep or moment of vertigo could result in a plunge into the churning water below, where survival would be impossible, where the violence of the falls would destroy a human body in seconds. This fear adds an edge to the experience, makes every viewpoint an act of courage as well as observation, turns sightseeing into something more visceral, more present, more conscious than the usual passive consumption of scenic beauty. But the fear is balanced by wonder, by the overwhelming sense of privilege at being able to witness this, at being present at one of the places where the Earth's power is most visibly, most dramatically on display, where the forces that shape landscapes and carve continents are operating in real time, where you can watch geology happening, can see the Zambezi River engaged in the work it has been doing for millennia, eroding the basalt, cutting deeper into the gorge, slowly but inexorably changing the landscape in ways that will eventually move the falls upstream, that will create new positions for the waterfall, new configurations of cliff and chasm and falling water.
The sound never stops, never diminishes, never allows you to forget even for a moment where you are and what is happening just beyond the veil of mist. It is the sound of power without restraint, of natural forces operating at scales that dwarf human capacity, of water doing what water does when given sufficient volume and height and nothing to stop it except the rock below, which it strikes with enough force to create spray that rises higher than the falls themselves, that creates a constant upward flow of mist that defies gravity through sheer velocity, through the momentum imparted by millions of tons of water striking the pool below every minute, every hour, every day, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. Walking back through the rainforest, away from the cliff edge, the sound gradually diminishing, though never entirely fading, your clothes soaked through and your hair dripping and your skin cool with moisture, you carry with you the memory of what you witnessed, the images and sensations and the sheer overwhelming presence of the falls. But you also carry questions, a curiosity about how such a thing came to exist, about the geological processes that created this fissure in the bedrock, about the history of the river and the peoples who have lived along its banks, about the plants and animals that thrive in the spray zone, about all the elements and forces and stories that converge at this place to create something that seems less like a natural feature and more like a threshold between worlds, a place where water becomes something more than water, where falling becomes transformation, where the ordinary physics of rivers and gravity produces results that feel miraculous, that inspire awe in proportion to their power, that remind us that the earth is still wild, still capable of creating phenomena that exceed our ability to fully comprehend or control or domesticate into mere scenery. The name Mosi-oa-Tunya, given by the Kololo people who inhabited this region in the 19th century, translates most literally as the smoke that thunders, a description so perfect in its precision and poetry that it captures both the visual and auditory character of the falls in a phrase that European names, however well-intentioned, cannot match. The smoke is the mist, that perpetual column of vapor visible from tens of kilometers away that rises and drifts and creates rainbows and obscures the actual falling water even as it announces its presence. The thunder is the sound, that sustained roar that never pauses, that can be heard from similar distances, that creates a sonic presence as unmistakable as the visual one. But the Kololo were not the first people here, were not the original inhabitants of the Zambezi Valley, were themselves relative newcomers, having migrated into the region in the early 19th century as part of larger population movements and conflicts in southern Africa. The peoples who had lived here longer, who had deeper historical roots in the landscape, had their own names and stories, their own ways of understanding and relating to the falls. The Tunga people, whose territory included the lands upstream and around the falls, knew the place intimately, had incorporated it into their geography and their mythology, had developed practices and beliefs that acknowledged both the power and the danger of this place, where the river disappeared into mist and thunder. For these indigenous peoples, the falls were not primarily a scenic wonder, not a tourist attraction or a geological curiosity, but a place of power that demanded respect, that required appropriate behavior, that could be dangerous to those who approached without proper understanding or preparation. The mist and the roar and the sheer violence of the falling water created an atmosphere that encouraged awe and caution, that made the falls feel like a threshold to other realms, a place where the ordinary world met something else, something powerful and potentially hostile, something that required acknowledgement and propitiation. Stories circulated about the pool below the falls, about spirits that inhabited the depths, about the dangers of approaching too close or disturbing the waters with irreverent behavior. These stories were not mere superstition, but practical wisdom encoded in narrative form, ways of ensuring that people, especially children, maintained appropriate caution around a place where a fall or a moment of carelessness could be fatal, where the power of the water was so great that rescue would be impossible, where the only safety lay in maintaining distance and respect. The stories also reflected a deeper understanding, a recognition that places of great power often feel sacred, not because of imposed religious doctrine, but because their sheer presence, their obvious capacity to create and destroy, naturally evokes responses that we call religious or spiritual because we have no better vocabulary for the mixture of awe and fear and respect that such places inspire. The falls played a role in regional geography and politics that went beyond their intrinsic qualities, serving as a landmark, a boundary, a point of reference in a landscape where fixed features were valuable for navigation and for defining territories. The smoke that rose above the falls could be seen from great distances, could orient travelers, could mark the location of the Zambezi even when the river itself was not visible through the vegetation. The gorges below the falls created barriers to easy crossing, channeled movements and migrations, influenced where people settled and how communities developed, shaped the human geography of the region in subtle but significant ways. Trade routes developed that took advantage of the Zambezi's navigability above the falls and the routes through the gorges below, creating networks of exchange that connected communities across hundreds of kilometers, that moved goods and ideas and people through a landscape where the falls were an essential feature, a place that everyone knew even if many never visited, a reference point in the mental maps that people carried, that structured their understanding of space and distance and the relationships between places. The falls were not isolated, not separate from human activity, but integrated into the living geography of the region, part of the context in which people lived and traveled and understood their world. The spiritual significance of the falls extended beyond individual beliefs to community practices and ceremonies. Certain rituals required the presence of the falls, required the mist and the thunder as backdrop and participant, as elements that added power and meaning to the human actions being performed. Prayers were offered, sacrifices made, important decisions confirmed or contested in the presence of this place where natural power was so obviously concentrated, where the veil between ordinary and extraordinary seemed thinner, where the responses to human petitions might come not from distant deities, but from the immediate and tangible presence of water and rock and the violence of their interaction. The relationship between people and falls was not static, but evolved over time, adapting to changing circumstances, incorporating new understandings while maintaining continuity with older traditions. Generations succeeded generations, each learning about the falls from their elders, each adding their own experiences and observations to the accumulated knowledge, each maintaining the stories and practices while also modifying them in response to their own needs and contexts. The falls themselves did not change appreciably within human timescales. The erosion that slowly moved the waterfall position upstream operated on geological time, imperceptible across individual lifetimes. But human understanding of the falls deepened and complexified, became richer with each generation's contributions. When Europeans began arriving in the region in the 19th century, they encountered not an unexplored wilderness, but a landscape thoroughly known and named and incorporated into human geography, a place where the falls had meanings and significances that the newcomers, with their different worldviews and priorities, often failed to understand or appreciate. The European tendency to see discovery where there was only new awareness, to impose their own names and categories on landscapes that already had perfectly adequate names and categories, reflected not the reality of the falls as a place known and visited and understood by local peoples for centuries, but the limitations of European imagination and the arrogance of colonial perspectives that equated unknown to us with unknown. The indigenous names persisted despite European renaming, continued to be used by local peoples, gradually spread to wider usage as post-colonial consciousnesses developed, as the inadequacy and inappropriateness of imposing European names on African landmarks became more widely recognized. Mosi-oa-Tunya competes now with Victoria Falls in signage and maps and tourist literature, a competition that reflects larger questions about names and ownership and whose perspectives should be privileged when describing places that have multiple histories, multiple meanings, multiple claims to legitimacy. The falls themselves are indifferent to these human debates, continue their work of falling and carving and creating mist and thunder regardless of what they're called, regardless of which stories are told about them, regardless of the human meanings projected onto them by peoples of different origins and different understandings. But for those who approach the falls with awareness of their deeper history, with knowledge of the indigenous names and stories, with respect for the peoples who knew this place long before Europeans arrived, the experience is richer,
more complex, more honest about the multiple layers of meaning that accumulate in any place that humans have known and visited and incorporated into their cultures and mythologies. The falls are not just scenic wonder or geological curiosity or tourist destination, but also sacred site, territorial marker, story setting, place of power, element of geography, all of these at once, simultaneously, refusing to be reduced to any single category or meaning, insisting on their multiplicity, their complexity, their refusal to fit neatly into any single framework of understanding. The Zambezi River begins far to the northwest, in northwestern Zambia near the border with Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, rising from a spring in a landscape of wetlands and low hills, beginning its journey as a trickle that any person could step across without getting their feet particularly wet. This humble beginning gives no indication of what the river will become, offers no suggestion that this small flow will grow into one of Africa's great rivers, will eventually carry enough water to create the world's largest curtain of falling water, will support ecosystems and human communities across 4 countries and nearly 3,000 kilometers of distance. From its source, the Zambezi flows south and then east, gathering tributaries, increasing in volume and power, cutting through landscapes that vary from wetlands to forests to floodplains to rocky gorges, each section of the river's course presenting different characteristics, different challenges, different relationships with the surrounding land. The upper Zambezi, above the falls, is relatively gentle, flows through broad floodplains during the wet season, creates wetlands that support extraordinary biodiversity, provides habitat for hippos and crocodiles and innumerable bird species, sustains fishing communities who have depended on the river's bounty for generations. The river's character in this upper section is shaped by the relatively flat terrain, the gentle gradients that allow the water to spread wide during floods, to retreat to defined channels during the dry season, to create a landscape that is half water and half land, that shifts between these states with the annual cycle of rains. The Barot's floodplain, one of the river's most distinctive features in its upper reaches, transforms each year from dry grassland to vast shallow lake as the rains upstream send pulses of water downstream, flooding the plain to depths that can exceed several meters, creating conditions that support a unique assemblage of species adapted to these seasonal fluctuations. The people living along the upper Zambezi have developed cultural practices and economic activities adapted to the river's seasonal rhythms, engaging in flood recession agriculture, fishing during high water, moving their settlements between dry season and wet season locations, maintaining a relationship with the river that is intimate and practical, that requires detailed knowledge of the river's behavior, of its annual cycles, of the ways to predict floods and droughts, of the ways to live sustainably in a landscape that is dynamic rather than static, that requires flexibility and adaptation rather than attempts to impose permanent structures or fixed boundaries.
As the Zambezi flows eastward across what is now Zambia, it continues gathering tributaries, continues growing in volume, begins to encounter changes in the underlying geology that will eventually lead to the falls. The river's course is controlled partly by the topography it flows through, partly by the patterns of rock resistance, flowing easily through softer formations, cutting more slowly through resistant layers, following weaknesses and faults in the bedrock, creating a path that reflects both the river's power to erode and the landscape's capacity to resist that erosion. The approach to Victoria Falls, the last few hundred kilometers of the river's journey before the plunge, shows a river that has matured, that has gathered enough water to be truly substantial, that flows with purpose and power through a landscape that is beginning to constrain it, that is narrowing the channel, concentrating the flow, preparing for the dramatic transformation that awaits at the basalt ledge where the earth drops away and the falls begin. The river here is hundreds of meters wide, flows at speeds that make crossing dangerous, carries enough water that its presence shapes the local climate, creates moisture and moderates temperature,
supports riverine forests along its banks that are greener and more dense than the surrounding woodland. Wildlife congregates along the river, drawn by the permanent water in a landscape where seasonal availability dominates most ecological relationships. Elephants come to drink and bathe, wading into the shallows, spraying water over their backs, wallowing in the mud along the banks. Hippos occupy pools and slow-flowing sections, spending their days submerged, emerging at night to graze on the grasses and plants along the shore. Crocodiles bask on sandbars, wait motionless for prey, occasionally take unwary animals that come too close to the water's edge. Birds of every description, herons and egrets, fish eagles and kingfishers, countless species that depend on the river for food and habitat, create a constant activity along the banks, a visual and auditory richness that reflects the river's productivity, its capacity to support life in a landscape where water is the limiting factor for most species. The river carries more than just water, carries sediment eroded from its upper reaches, dissolved minerals leached from the rocks it flows over, organic material from the plants and animals that live in and along its course, all the substances that transform clear rainwater into the complex solution that constitutes a living river. The sediment load varies with season, with flow rate, with the intensity of erosion occurring in the watershed, creating water that ranges from relatively clear during low flow to thick and brown during floods, water that carries within it the evidence of everything the river has encountered, everything it has picked up and transported, everything it is moving from interior highlands toward eventual discharge into the Indian Ocean more than 2,000 kilometers downstream. But before the ocean, before the lower Zambezi and the coastal plains and the delta, the river must first negotiate Victoria Falls, must make that spectacular plunge over the basalt ledge, must transform from horizontal flow to vertical freefall and back to horizontal flow again, must pass through a moment of violence and chaos that will scatter its water into mist and spray, that will create rainbows and thunder and the entire complex of phenomena that makes the falls one of Earth's great natural wonders. The river approaching the falls knows nothing of what awaits, simply follows the gradient, responds to gravity, flows toward the point where the bedrock fractures and the path downward opens, and the familiar horizontal movement gives way to something entirely different, to a fall that no fish can ascend, that divides the river's ecology into above falls and below falls populations, that creates a barrier that influences the distribution of species and the patterns of evolution throughout the basin. The volume of water approaching the falls varies enormously with season, creating falls that are essentially different depending on when you visit, on whether the rains have come and how intense they have been, on whether this is a wet year or a dry year, on all the meteorological variables that determine how much water the upper Zambezi receives, and therefore how much water arrives at the falls to make its spectacular descent. At peak flow, during and immediately after the wet season, the river carries more than 500 million liters per minute over the falls, a volume that creates spray visible from 50 kilometers away, that produces thunder audible from even greater distances, that makes the cliff edge paths almost impassable from the intensity of the soaking rain created by the mist. During the dry season, the flow diminishes dramatically, can fall to as little as 10% of peak volume, transforming the falls from an overwhelming curtain of water to a series of distinct cataracts, exposing rock faces that remain hidden during high water, allowing visitors to see the underlying structure of the falls, to understand the geology in ways that are impossible when the water is at flood stage. This variation means that the falls are not a constant, not a fixed phenomenon, but something that transforms throughout the year, that presents different faces in different seasons, that rewards multiple visits at different times, each offering experiences that the others cannot provide. The river's journey to the falls, its 2,500-kilometer flow from source to precipice, is essential to understanding what makes the falls possible, what creates the volume of water necessary to produce such spectacular results. A small stream falling the same distance would create a modest waterfall, interesting but not exceptional, lacking the power and the presence that come from having an entire major river in freefall. The Zambezi arrives at the falls carrying the accumulated water of a huge drainage basin, representing the rain that has fallen across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, concentrated and focused into this single flow, this massive ribbon of water that will soon be dispersed into mist and spray and eventually reassembled below into a river again, diminished slightly by evaporation, but essentially intact, continuing its journey toward the sea, toward the completion of the water cycle that brought rain to the highlands and sent it flowing toward the ocean from which it originated.
To understand Victoria Falls, to comprehend why the Zambezi plunges over a precipice here rather than flowing continuously from its source to the sea, you must understand the geology beneath your feet, the deep history written in the bedrock, the story of volcanic eruptions and erosion, and the slow work of water exploiting weaknesses in stone. The foundation of the falls is basalt, that dark, fine-grained rock that forms when lava cools relatively quickly, when volcanic eruptions send molten rock flowing across the landscape, covering it in layers that solidify into resistant stone, creating plateaus and escarpments and features that shape surface water flow for millions of years after the volcanic activity has ceased. The basalt at Victoria Falls is not a single uniform layer, but multiple flows, each representing a separate eruption, each having solidified separately, creating boundaries and interfaces where the properties of the rock change slightly, where weaknesses develop, where water can preferentially erode. These layers were laid down approximately 200 million years ago during the Jurassic period, when the supercontinent Gondwana was beginning to fracture, when volcanic activity was widespread across what would eventually become southern Africa, when enormous volumes of lava poured out across the landscape, building thick sequences of basalt that would fundamentally shape the region's future topography. After the volcanic activity ceased, after the last lava flows had solidified and the region had cooled, erosion began its slow work of wearing down the basalt plateau, of removing material, of creating the relief and the drainage patterns that would eventually channel the Zambezi toward its present course. But erosion of basalt is slow, the rock is resistant, wears away gradually even under sustained attack by flowing water, creates landscapes where rivers can flow for long distances without cutting deeply, where waterfalls and rapids develop where the river encounters especially resistant layers, or where structural features create sudden changes in gradient. The crucial feature at Victoria Falls is not the basalt itself, but the fractures that cut through it, the vertical weaknesses in the rock where erosion can proceed much faster than through intact basalt, where water can exploit these zones of weakness to create the deep, narrow gorges that characterize the falls and the downstream canyon system. These fractures formed when the rock cooled and contracted, when stresses in the crust created joint patterns, when movements along faults propagated cracks through the brittle basalt. The fractures are not random, but show systematic orientations, form patterns, create a network of potential pathways where erosion can concentrate its efforts. The falls themselves exist at the intersection between a resistant basalt layer and one of these major fractures, a crack in the bedrock that runs roughly east-west across the path of the north-flowing Zambezi, creating a line of weakness where erosion could proceed faster than in the surrounding intact rock. The river, arriving at this line of weakness, began to exploit it, began to erode downward along the fracture, began to create the chasm that would eventually become deep enough to constitute a waterfall, high enough to generate the spectacular falling water and mist that characterize the modern falls. But the current position of the falls is not where this process began, is not the original location of the Zambezi's descent from the basalt plateau.
Upstream, carved into the bedrock below the present falls, are a series of gorges, zigzagging canyons that mark previous positions of the waterfall, evidence of how the falls have retreated upstream over geological time, how the process of erosion has moved the lip of the waterfall progressively further from its original position, how the entire sequence of canyon cutting represents hundreds of thousands of years of the river's work. The mechanism of this retreat is straightforward in principle, though complex in detail. Water falling over the precipice strikes the pool below with enormous force, creates turbulence and erosion at the base of the falls, undercuts the basalt cliff, creates an overhang that eventually becomes unstable and collapses, sending massive blocks of rock tumbling into the pool below, leaving a fresh vertical face and moving the waterfall lip slightly upstream. This process repeats endlessly, collapse after collapse, each removing a bit more rock, each moving the falls a bit further back, each creating new talus at the base of the cliff that must be broken down and transported away before the next collapse can occur. The rate of retreat varies with the volume of water flowing over the falls, with the resistance of the particular rock layer being eroded, with the spacing of the vertical fractures that control where collapse can occur. Estimates suggest that the falls retreat upstream at rates of roughly 1 meter per 1,000 years averaged over long periods, though the process is episodic rather than continuous, happens in sudden catastrophic events, major collapses, separated by long periods of relative stability, when erosion proceeds but collapses do not occur. The gorges below the present falls tell the story of this retreat in spectacular fashion. The Batoka Gorge, the first gorge below the falls, runs roughly east-west, following the fracture system that the current falls occupy, creating a narrow chasm where the entire Zambezi is compressed into a channel only 60 meters wide in some places, where the water that spread across more than a mile at the falls above is now concentrated and accelerated, creating some of the most intense whitewater rapids anywhere on Earth, creating conditions that challenge even experienced rafters, that demand respect and caution and careful navigation. Below the Batoka Gorge, the river turns north through a series of zigzag canyons, each turn marking a previous position of the waterfall, each gorge segment following a different fracture in the basalt, creating a complex three-dimensional maze that the river has carved over hundreds of thousands of years as the falls have retreated from an original position many kilometers downstream to their current location. These gorges are geological textbooks written in stone, each layer and feature and erosional form documenting processes and timescales, recording the history of the river's interaction with the bedrock, preserving evidence of how waterfalls grow and retreat and eventually disappear as erosion proceeds.
Looking at these gorges from above, from viewpoints along the rim or from aircraft or from the spectacular bridge that spans the chasm just below the modern falls, you are seeing deep time made visible. Seeing the accumulated results of processes operating over spans that make human history seem brief, that make civilizations seem ephemeral, that demonstrate the patience of geology, the inevitability of change given sufficient time, the slow but inexorable transformation of landscapes under the persistent action of flowing water. The future of the falls is written in the bedrock beneath them, in the next fracture upstream where erosion will eventually concentrate, where the next position of the waterfall will develop. Geologists have identified likely locations for future falls, have mapped the fracture patterns, have predicted roughly where the Zambezi will plunge when the current falls have eroded completely through their present position and the waterfall lip has retreated to the next upstream fracture. This future is tens of thousands of years away at minimum, perhaps much longer, operates on timescales that make prediction uncertain and verification impossible. But the general pattern is clear. The falls will continue to retreat upstream, will continue to carve new gorges, will continue the work they have been doing for ages, will eventually move far enough back that the present falls become just another segment of the Batoka Gorge, remembered only in the rock record, visible only to those who can read geological stories written in canyon walls and erosional features. The basalt that makes this all possible, that provides both the resistant caprock that creates the waterfall and the fracture patterns that control its position and evolution, is itself temporary on geological timescales, is being slowly worn away, will eventually be reduced to scattered remnants and then to nothing as erosion proceeds, as the landscape is lowered, as the rivers carry material toward the sea and reduce the highlands to plains. But this too is a process measured in millions of years, proceeds so slowly that the basalt might as well be eternal from human perspectives, will certainly outlast our species and probably many species that succeed us, will be here providing the foundation for waterfalls and gorges and all the spectacular scenery they create long after the last human has observed them and marveled and tried to understand the forces and timescales involved in their creation. The numbers are almost too large to comprehend, require abstract thought rather than direct intuition, numbers that must be understood intellectually because they cannot be grasped experientially, cannot be felt or seen or heard in any direct way that makes their magnitude truly real. The falls are 1,700 meters wide at their maximum extent, more than a mile of falling water when the Zambezi is at flood, a curtain that stretches from horizon to horizon when you stand at certain viewpoints, that seems to extend infinitely in both directions, that makes width itself become a quality that loses meaning because the scale exceeds what vision can easily process. The height of the falls, the vertical distance that the water drops, varies along their length because the basalt ledge is not perfectly level, because erosion has proceeded at different rates in different locations, because the lip of the falls shows variation in elevation that creates distinct cataracts during low water, separate streams that combine into a more continuous curtain during flood stage. The maximum height is approximately 108 meters, 355 feet, measured from the highest point of the lip to the level of the pool below, a drop that is more than twice the height of Niagara Falls, that places Victoria Falls among the world's tallest single-drop waterfalls, that gives the falling water time to accelerate, to reach velocities approaching terminal velocity before it strikes the pool below with impacts that create spray and thunder. The volume of water flowing over the falls varies seasonally and annually by factors of 50 or more, creating essentially different waterfalls depending on when you visit. At peak flow, typically occurring in April or May after the wet season rains have made their way down the Zambezi from the upper watershed, more than 500 million liters of water per minute plunge over the falls, a volume that is difficult to visualize, that represents more water than most people will see in their entire lives, that accumulates from a vast drainage basin and concentrates into this single flow, this spectacular descent that is happening continuously, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day throughout the flood period. During the dry season, typically in November, at the end of the long rainless period, when the upper Zambezi has been depleting its stored water for months without significant replenishment from precipitation, the flow can diminish to as little as 10 million liters per minute, still a substantial flow by most standards, but dramatically less than the flood peak, reduced enough that the continuous curtain of falling water fragments into distinct streams, that previously hidden portions of the basalt cliff become visible, that it becomes possible to stand at certain viewpoints and see the rock face behind the water, to understand the structure of the falls in ways that are impossible when the water is at flood. This seasonal variation means that descriptions of Victoria Falls must always specify when the observation was made, must acknowledge that the falls are not constant but dynamic, that what you see in April is fundamentally different from what you see in November, that choosing when to visit determines which version of the falls you will experience, which character it will present. Some visitors prefer the flood season, want to see the falls at maximum power, want to experience the overwhelming spray and thunder and sheer volume of water in descent.
Others prefer the dry season, value the visibility, the ability to see the underlying geology, the accessibility of viewpoints that become impassable during flood, the gentler experience that allows contemplation rather than mere survival in the face of the spray's intensity.
The spray that rises from the falls, that creates the smoke that gives Mosi-oa-Tunya its name, can reach heights of 400 meters or more during peak flow, climbing in turbulent columns driven by the force of falling water displacing air, by the updrafts created as cooler air rushes in to replace the air pushed upward by the impact, by the dynamics of spray formation, where water breaks into droplets and mist and becomes entrained in moving air, rising far higher than the falls themselves, visible from distances that make the falls themselves still below the horizon, announcing their presence to travelers who are still hours or days away from actually arriving. This spray creates the rainforest that cloaks the cliffs along the falls, that transforms what would otherwise be relatively dry woodland into lush tropical forest, that supports species that could not otherwise exist in this region, that creates a microclimate so distinct from the surrounding landscape that crossing from the forest into the dry woodland beyond is like crossing between different continents, between different climate zones, experiencing in a few hundred meters of distance variations that normally require traveling thousands of kilometers in latitude. The constant moisture, the year-round water availability, the moderated temperatures that the spray provides all combine to create conditions that certain plants and animals require that allow them to thrive here while being absent from the surrounding regions. The rainbows that form in the spray are among the fall's most spectacular features, occurring whenever sunlight strikes the mist at appropriate angles, whenever the geometry of sun and observer and spray creates the conditions that produce the color separation and the arc that characterizes rainbows everywhere. At Victoria Falls, the spray is so dense and so persistent that rainbows are almost constant during daylight hours when the falls are flowing strongly, sometimes appearing as complete circular arcs, sometimes as fragments in partial bands, sometimes as double or even triple bows when conditions are exactly right, creating visual displays that enhance the already spectacular falls, that add color and geometry to the white water and dark rock and green vegetation. During full moon periods, when lunar light is strong enough to create the same optical phenomena that sunlight produces, lunar rainbows appear in the spray, ghostly silver arcs that are visible to dark adapted eyes, that create an entirely different experience of the falls, transform the nighttime visit into something magical, something that seems to operate by different rules than daytime reality, something that demonstrates that the fall's spectacle extends beyond normal visiting hours, beyond the usual human schedule, continues through darkness with the moon creating its own version of the rainbows, its own illumination of the spray, its own revelations of what this place contains and creates. The measurement of these numbers, the determination of how wide and how high and how much water, requires sophisticated surveying and monitoring, requires instruments and calculations and repeated observations to account for the variations in water level and flow rate, to distinguish between maximum and minimum conditions, to provide numbers that accurately represent the falls while acknowledging their dynamic nature, their refusal to be reduced to single static values. Early measurements were crude, based on estimates and rough calculations, gradually refined as better instruments and methods became available, as the importance of accurate data became clear for both scientific understanding and practical management, as the falls became not just scenic wonder, but object of study, subject of quantification, phenomenon to be measured and monitored and understood in numerical terms as well as aesthetic and experiential ones. But numbers, however large and carefully measured, cannot capture the experience of standing at the cliff edge, of being soaked by spray and deafened by thunder, of feeling the earth vibrate beneath your feet with the impact of millions of tons of water per hour, of seeing the rainbows and the falling water and the chasm that swallows the river, of experiencing in your body and your senses the sheer overwhelming reality of this place.
The numbers provide context, give scale, allow comparisons, help understanding, but they cannot substitute for presence, cannot replace the direct encounter with the falls in all their power and complexity and beauty, cannot make you feel what it is to stand in that spray and that sound and that mist and understand, not intellectually but viscerally, what it means for an entire major river to simply drop away, to plunge over a precipice and disappear into the chasm below, to create in its falling a spectacle that justifies traveling from anywhere on earth to witness, that rewards the journey with experiences that endure in memory long after the spray has dried and the sound has faded, and the return to ordinary landscapes makes the falls seem like something dreamed rather than something actually encountered, actually witnessed, actually experienced in physical reality. David Livingstone arrived at the falls on November 16, 1855, traveling by canoe down the Zambezi with local guides who had tried to prepare him for what he was about to see, but whose descriptions he later wrote failed to capture the reality, failed to convey the scale and the power and the sheer spectacle of the falls. Livingstone was not the first European to hear of the falls, not the first to receive reports from African sources about a great waterfall on the Zambezi, but he was the first European to actually reach them, to stand at the edge and look down into the chasm, to witness what he immediately recognized as one of the great natural wonders of the world.
His approach to the falls followed the pattern that local peoples had used for generations, coming along the river's north bank, moving through the forest where the spray's moisture supported vegetation denser than the surrounding woodland, hearing the thunder long before seeing the falls themselves, following the sound toward its source. When he finally reached a viewpoint where the falls were visible, where he could see the Zambezi disappearing over the edge and the spray rising in vast columns above the chasm, he was, by his own account, stunned, unable immediately to process what he was seeing, needing time to absorb the scale and the violence and the beauty of the scene before him. Livingstone's response to the falls mixed scientific observation with aesthetic appreciation and missionary zeal, seeing in this natural wonder evidence of divine creation, finding in its power and beauty confirmation of his beliefs about the world's design and purpose. He wrote detailed descriptions of the fall's dimensions and character, made measurements and sketches, tried to capture in words what he was witnessing so that readers in Britain could understand what he had discovered. But he also struggled with the inadequacy of language, with the difficulty of conveying through mere description something that demanded direct experience, that exceeded the capacity of words to fully represent. His decision to name the falls after Queen Victoria was both conventional and problematic. Conventional because European explorers routinely named geographical features after monarchs and patrons. Problematic because it ignored the perfectly adequate indigenous name, imposed a European identity on an African landmark, participated in the larger colonial project of claiming and renaming and appropriating landscapes and peoples and resources. That the indigenous name has persisted, has increasingly displaced the colonial name in common usage, reflects post-colonial recognition that places belong to the peoples who have known them longest, that names matter, that what we call things influences how we think about them and who we imagine has authority over them. Livingstone's visit was brief, constrained by his larger mission to explore the Zambezi and assess its potential for navigation and commerce, to map its course and understand its character in service of British commercial and missionary interests. He spent only a few hours at the falls, enough time to make basic observations and measurements, to capture initial impressions, but not enough to fully explore the area or to understand the falls in any depth. His descriptions, when published in his travel narratives, introduced Victoria Falls to European audiences, created international awareness of this African wonder, began the process by which the falls would become famous beyond the region, would attract visitors and scientists and eventually tourists, would transform from local landmark to global destination.
The European discovery of Victoria Falls, like all such discoveries, was not a revelation of the previously unknown, but an introduction of the already known to a different audience, a connection between European awareness and African reality, a moment when information crossed cultural boundaries and entered a different network of knowledge and communication. The falls had been known to local peoples for as long as people had lived in the region, had been named and visited and incorporated into stories and practices, had been thoroughly discovered in every meaningful sense. What changed with Livingstone's arrival was not the falls' existence, but European knowledge of that existence, not the reality, but the audience aware of that reality. Subsequent European visitors to the falls came with different purposes and perspectives, some as explorers continuing the mapping of Africa's interior, some as hunters seeking trophies and adventure, some as missionaries following Livingstone's example, some as colonial administrators and commercial interests assessing the region's potential for exploitation and development. Each brought their own preconceptions and priorities. Each saw the falls through the filter of their particular interests and worldviews. Each contributed to the growing body of European knowledge about this African wonder, while often failing to appreciate or understand the indigenous knowledge that already existed, that could have informed their observations and enriched their understanding if they had been willing to learn from African sources rather than simply imposing European categories and values. The colonial period that followed Livingstone's discovery brought significant changes to the falls and the surrounding region, transforming them from relatively isolated natural wonder visited primarily by local peoples to increasingly accessible tourist destination, commercial resource, and contested territory divided between colonial powers. The border between what became Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, later Zambia and Zimbabwe, was drawn through the middle of the falls, bisecting the wonder, creating a political boundary where none had existed before, complicating questions of access and control and ownership that persist to the present day. The construction of Victoria Falls Bridge in 1905, spanning the gorge just below the falls, was both engineering achievement and imperial symbol, demonstrating colonial capacity for major infrastructure projects while also facilitating commercial and military movement across the Zambezi, opening the region to greater exploitation and control. The bridge is spectacular in its own right, a steel arch spanning more than 100 meters across the chasm, built by European engineers using materials shipped from Britain, constructed by African labor working under dangerous conditions where falls meant certain death in the churning water far below. The town that grew up near the falls, initially called Old Drift and later Victoria Falls, developed primarily as a service center for tourists and as a colonial administrative post, bringing permanent European settlement to the area, creating infrastructure and amenities that made visiting the falls easier and more comfortable, but that also increasingly separated visitors from direct engagement with the landscape, that mediated the experience of the falls through hotels and guided tours and designated viewpoints, through the apparatus of tourism that made the falls more accessible, while perhaps making them less immediate, less raw, less transformative than they had been when reaching them required significant journey and engagement with the landscape on its own terms.
The relationship between European discovery and African knowledge, between colonial appropriation and indigenous ownership, between the names and meanings imposed by newcomers and the names and meanings that existed before their arrival, remains complex and contested at Victoria Falls, as at so many places where colonial and post-colonial histories intersect. The falls exist independent of these human debates, continue their work of falling and creating spray and carving gorges regardless of what they are called or who claims them or how their story is told. But for humans seeking to understand and appreciate the falls fully, to engage with them honestly and respectfully, grappling with this history is essential, requires acknowledging multiple perspectives, recognizing that discovery is always contextual, always depends on whose knowledge and whose awareness we are considering, always involves questions of power and representation that extend far beyond the merely geographical or scenic.
The Batoka Gorge begins where the falls end, where the water that has plunged over the precipice collects itself from the chaos of spray and impact, where the Zambezi reassembles from dispersed droplets into a coherent river flowing through a chasm so narrow and deep that the entire character of the water changes, transforms from the broad, placid flow above the falls into compressed violence, into rapids that rank among the most challenging whitewater anywhere on Earth, into a river that has been fundamentally altered by its passage over the falls, that emerges changed, concentrated, dangerous in entirely new ways. The gorge walls rise vertically from the water, dark basalt cliffs that trap the river in a channel sometimes as narrow as 60 meters, that create conditions where the entire flow of the Zambezi, all those millions of liters per minute, must pass through a space you could almost throw a stone across, where the water has nowhere to go but forward with increasing velocity, where rapids form not from obstacles in the streambed, but from the sheer volume of water forced through too narrow a passage, from the hydraulics of confined flow, where pressure and turbulence create standing waves and holes and features that make navigation both thrilling and terrifying. The rapids in the Batoka Gorge are numbered and named, each one characterized and rated, each presenting specific challenges and requiring specific strategies, each having claimed lives from those who underestimated their power or overestimated their own abilities, each deserving the respect that any genuinely dangerous natural feature commands. Commercial rafting companies take clients down these rapids, provide equipment and guides and safety measures, make it possible for people with relatively limited whitewater experience to run some of the world's most spectacular rapids, to experience the terror and exhilaration of being in a small inflatable boat being thrown about by massive hydraulic forces, being soaked and spun and occasionally flipped, being briefly and intensely reminded of how powerful water can be, how small and vulnerable humans are when we venture into environments where nature's forces operate at scales that dwarf our capacity to control or resist them. The gorge itself is a geological marvel, a textbook example of how rivers carve canyons, how sustained flow concentrated in a narrow channel can cut deeply into resistant rock, how the patterns of fractures in the basalt control where and how erosion proceeds, creating the zigzag pattern of gorges that documents the fall's retreat over hundreds of thousands of years. Each turn in the gorge marks a previous position of the waterfall. Each straight section follows a different fracture in the bedrock, creating a three-dimensional maze that the river has carved through patient erosion, through the endless work of moving water transporting sediment, through the slow grinding away of rock that characterizes all river systems given sufficient time. Walking along the rim of the gorge, looking down at the river far below, you are seeing a cross-section through geological time, seeing layers of basalt exposed in the cliff walls, seeing the patterns of cooling and fracturing that characterize volcanic rock, seeing evidence of the processes that created this landscape and the processes that continue to modify it, that will eventually obliterate the current configuration and replace it with something else, that operate on timescales that make human lifetimes seem insignificant, that make all our constructions and concerns temporary, that remind us that the Earth's processes proceed without reference to human presence or preferences, that we are guests here at best, observers of forces that preceded us and will continue long after we are gone. The water in the gorge, when you finally descend to river level, either by the steep paths that wind down the cliff face or by being dropped in by helicopter to begin a rafting trip, is different from the water above the falls, is charged with energy from the plunge, is moving faster, is more turbulent, has been transformed by its experience of falling and crashing and being broken into spray and reassembling. The water temperature is slightly higher from the energy imparted by the fall, from the conversion of gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy and then into heat through the violence of impact and turbulence. The dissolved gas content has changed, with increased oxygen from the aeration that occurs during the fall, making the water below the falls different chemically as well as physically from the water above the falls. The rapids themselves are spectacular, with names that hint at their character and their danger. The boiling pot, where the gorge narrows most dramatically and the water churns in a massive whirlpool. Stairway to Heaven, with its series of steep drops and standing waves. Oblivion, where the consequences of mistakes are most severe. Morning Glory and Devil's Toilet Bowl and Gnashing Jaws of Death. Names that are partly marketing, partly accurate description, entirely evocative of what it feels like to approach these features in a raft, to commit to the line through the rapid, knowing that there is no turning back, that the water will take you where it wants to take you, regardless of your intentions, that your role is to respond as best you can to forces you cannot control, to stay in the raft if possible and swim as quickly as you can to shore if you go in, to trust your guide and your equipment and your own resilience while acknowledging that none of these are guarantees, that the river is ultimately in charge, that you are borrowing a path through its domain on terms it sets and you accept. The ecology of the gorge is distinct from both the river above the falls and the river further downstream, is shaped by the extreme conditions of the rapids, by the high-energy environment where few organisms can survive, by the constant scouring and turbulence that prevent the establishment of the usual riverine communities. Fish populations below the falls are different from those above, separated by a barrier they cannot cross, evolving independently, adapting to different conditions, creating genetic divergence that reflects the fall's role not just as spectacular scenery, but as significant ecological boundary, as feature that influences the distribution and evolution of species throughout the Zambezi Basin.
The gorge walls support their own ecosystems, with plants clinging to crevices, with birds nesting on ledges, with animals using the cliff faces for movement and shelter, with communities adapted to the vertical environment, to the limited water availability between rainy seasons, to the exposure to sun and wind, and the periodic floods that can raise the river level dramatically, that can inundate areas that are normally dry, that create dynamic conditions requiring significant adaptation from the species that live here. The biodiversity is not high in the gorge itself. The conditions are too extreme, too variable. But the species that do exist here are often specialized, often endemic, found nowhere else because the combination of conditions that the gorge provides exists nowhere else, because evolution has shaped them specifically for this environment, because they represent the living evidence of how life finds ways to occupy every available niche, every set of conditions that provides even minimal opportunity for survival and reproduction. The rock walls of the gorge show evidence of the river's work, show patterns of erosion and deposition, show high water marks and scour lines, show the textures that flowing water creates in resistant rock over long periods of sustained contact and abrasion. Reading these features requires geological training and experience, requires understanding how different patterns of erosion indicate different flow conditions, how the shapes of cavities and undercuts reveal the direction and velocity of ancient floods, how the whole complex of features documents the gorge's history, records the river's behavior over timescales that exceed human memory, that require geological rather than historical methods to reconstruct and understand. The future of the Batoka Gorge is to be slowly filled as erosion proceeds, as the talus from collapsing walls accumulates, as sediment transported by floods deposits in slower sections, as the river gradually builds up the gorge floor while simultaneously continuing to cut downward where conditions favor erosion over deposition. This is the fate of all gorges eventually, to be eroded away, to be filled in, to be transformed from dramatic canyons into gentler valleys, and eventually into barely perceptible swales in landscapes that have been planed down by millions of years of erosion. But this fate is distant, operates on timescales so long that the current configuration will persist for thousands of generations of humans, will remain a spectacular feature long enough that its eventual transformation is more theoretical than practical concern, more an acknowledgement of geological inevitability than an immediate threat to the gorge's existence or accessibility. Standing at the bottom of the gorge, looking up at the walls that rise vertically on both sides,
hearing the roar of the next rapid downstream, feeling the spray from the turbulent water nearby. You are in a space that humans do not normally occupy, that exists outside the usual contexts of human life, that demands attention and respect and careful movement, that can kill you if you make mistakes or take unnecessary risks, but that also offers experiences and perspectives that are simply unavailable elsewhere, that justify the danger and the difficulty through the intensity and uniqueness of what they provide, through the memories and the understanding and the sense of having encountered something genuinely wild, genuinely powerful, genuinely beyond human control or domestication. The Zambezi is not constant throughout the year, does not flow with uniform volume from January through December, but responds dramatically to the seasonal patterns of rainfall across its vast drainage basin, creating a river that expands and contracts, that floods and recedes, that presents entirely different characters depending on when you encounter it. Understanding Victoria Falls requires understanding this seasonality, requires recognizing that the falls in April are fundamentally different from the falls in November, that timing your visit determines which version of this wonder you will experience, which face it will present, which opportunities and challenges it will offer. The wet season in the Zambezi Basin generally extends from November to April, though the timing and intensity vary from year to year, depending on larger climate patterns, on the position of convergence zones and the behavior of Indian Ocean weather systems, on all the complex meteorological factors that determine when and where and how much rain will fall across southern Africa. During the wet season, particularly from January through March or April, heavy rains fall across the upper Zambezi watershed, saturating soils, filling rivers and tributaries, sending pulses of high water downstream toward the falls, creating the conditions that produce maximum flow and maximum spectacle. The peak flow at the falls typically occurs in April or early May, reflecting the time lag between when rain falls in the upper basin and when that water makes its way down the 2,000 kilometers of river to reach Victoria Falls. At peak flow, the statistics become almost absurd, more than 500 million liters per minute plunging over the precipice, creating a curtain of water more than a mile wide and completely continuous, generating spray that rises 400 meters or more into the air, creating thunder audible from 50 kilometers away, producing rainfall in the spray zone that exceeds actual precipitation from clouds, soaking everything within hundreds of meters of the falls with a constant deluge that makes some viewpoints completely inaccessible, that turns paths into streams and makes photography nearly impossible without elaborate protective measures for equipment. Visiting the falls during peak flow is an overwhelming experience, almost too much sensory input to process, too much water and spray and sound and motion to fully comprehend. The spray is so intense that you cannot see the actual falling water from most viewpoints, can only infer its presence from the vast quantities of mist rising from the chasm, from the thunder that fills the air, from the rainbows that form in the spray whenever the sun breaks through. The paths along the cliff edge become rivers themselves, water streaming downhill from the constant rain of condensed spray, making walking treacherous, making staying dry impossible, making the entire experience an exercise in acceptance, in surrendering to the water, in allowing yourself to be completely soaked while trying to capture whatever glimpses of the falls the shifting winds and varying spray intensity occasionally permit.
The power during peak flow is almost frightening. Creates a sense that this much water in motion is dangerous, even at a distance, even with barriers and designated viewpoints and all the infrastructure designed to keep visitors safe. The vibration in the ground, the physical sensation of the earth shaking with the impact of the falling water, communicates more directly than any statistic or description what it means to have an entire major river in free fall, what kind of forces are being released, what kind of energy is being dissipated in the conversion of gravitational potential energy to kinetic energy, to heat and sound and the work of erosion. It is not hyperbole to say that standing at the falls during peak flow is one of Earth's great natural experiences, something that should be on any list of phenomena worth witnessing, worth traveling for, worth enduring the discomfort and the expense and the simple physical challenge of being there in person. But the falls at low flow during the dry season offer an entirely different experience,
equally valuable, though in different ways. As the dry season progresses, as months pass without significant rainfall in the watershed, as the Zambezi depletes its stored water without replenishment, the flow over the falls diminishes dramatically. By November, at the end of the long dry period, the flow may be reduced to 10 or 15% of peak, transforming the continuous curtain of water into a series of distinct cataracts, exposing sections of the basalt cliff that remain hidden during high water, allowing visitors to see the underlying structure of the falls, to understand the geology in ways that are impossible when the water is at flood. During low flow, the spray is modest, the thunder diminished, the rainbows present but less dramatic, the overall experience quieter, more contemplative, more accessible in both practical and perceptual terms. You can stand at viewpoints that would be impossible during flood, can see the rock face clearly, can photograph the falls without worrying about water destroying your camera, can move through the spray zone without being completely soaked. The Devil's Pool becomes accessible during this period, that natural rock pool at the very edge of the falls where people can swim safely during low water, can approach the precipice from the river itself, can look over the edge while being held back from the drop by the rock barrier that only emerges when the water level falls below a certain threshold. The seasonality of the falls creates a kind of ecological rhythm, a pattern of availability and transformation that influences not just human visitation, but the behavior of animals and plants, that determines when certain species can access certain resources, when movement across the river becomes possible or impossible, when the spray zone expands or contracts, when the microclimates along the falls experience different conditions. Birds time their breeding to take advantage of peak insect availability that correlates with water flow. Plants in the spray zone respond to the changing moisture regimes. Fish populations adjust their movements and behaviors to the varying water levels, the entire ecosystem pulsing with the river's annual cycle. Understanding this seasonality, planning visits to coincide with personal preferences for high flow or low flow experiences is part of engaging intelligently with Victoria Falls, recognizing that natural phenomena are not static displays but dynamic processes, that timing matters, that when you visit determines what you encounter. Some visitors return multiple times, seeing the falls in different seasons, collecting experiences across the range of conditions, building a more complete understanding of the fall's character by witnessing its transformations, by seeing both the overwhelming power of flood and the exposed structure of low water, by experiencing the full range of what this place can be. Climate change is adding new complexity and uncertainty to these seasonal patterns, is altering rainfall distributions across the Zambezi Basin, is creating more extreme floods and more severe droughts, is making the timing and magnitude of flows less predictable, more variable, potentially more difficult to manage for ecological health and human uses. The severe drought of 2019 reduced the falls to the lowest flows in decades, transforming them into a series of modest streams, creating images that shocked people accustomed to seeing the falls at flood, raising questions about whether this represented normal variability or a new pattern, whether climate change was fundamentally altering the fall's behavior, or whether this was simply an extreme instance of natural variation that has always characterized the Zambezi's flow. These questions matter because Victoria Falls is not just scenic wonder, but economic asset, supporting tourism industries that employ thousands of people, generating revenue that supports conservation and community development, attracting visitors whose spending flows through local and national economies. Reduced flow means reduced tourist appeal, means fewer visitors, means economic impacts that extend far beyond the immediate falls area, that affect communities throughout the region, that create pressures to develop other attractions or other economic activities that potentially threaten the long-term viability of conservation efforts that depend on tourism revenue for their funding and political support. But the falls themselves are indifferent to these human concerns. Simply respond to the water they receive, fall with whatever volume the Zambezi delivers, create spray and sound and rainbows in proportion to the flow, continue their work of erosion regardless of whether that work is happening faster or slower than in previous decades, regardless of whether humans find the results beautiful or disappointing, spectacular or diminished. The falls existed long before humans knew them, will continue existing long after our current concerns and impacts have faded into irrelevance, will follow the logic of geology and hydrology and chemistry without reference to human preferences or human timescales, will be what they are, regardless of what we want them to be.
The view from above transforms understanding, provides perspectives that are simply unavailable from the ground, reveals patterns and relationships that are invisible from the cliff edge or the river level. Flying over Victoria Falls in a helicopter or microlight, rising above the spray and the gorges, seeing the entire complex from an aerial vantage, you understand for the first time how the falls fit into the larger landscape, how the river approaches and departs, how the gorges zigzag downstream, marking the fall's retreat through geological time, how the spray zone creates its island of green in the otherwise drier woodland, how the whole phenomenon exists as a feature within a broader geographical context that the ground-level experience necessarily fragments and parcels into separate viewpoints and partial perspectives. The helicopter flight, typically 15 or 20 minutes depending on which route you choose, launches from an airfield near the town of Victoria Falls, climbs quickly to provide overview of the area, then approaches the falls themselves, the pilot positioning the aircraft to provide optimal views while maintaining safe distance from the spray column, which can create turbulence and visibility problems, which contains enough water to damage engines or reduce lift, which represents a real hazard despite its beautiful appearance. The noise of the helicopter is substantial, requires headphones both for hearing protection and for listening to the pilot's commentary, creates a mechanical intrusion into what is otherwise a natural scene, but also enables access to perspectives that are worth the compromise, that provide understanding unavailable through any other means. From above, the full width of the falls becomes apparent in ways that are impossible from the ground, where spray and viewpoint limitations prevent seeing the entire curtain of falling water at once. The mile-wide extent of the precipice, the way it cuts across the landscape in a nearly straight line following the fracture in the basalt, the continuity of the waterfall from one end to the other during high flow, all of this becomes clear from the air, becomes visually comprehensible in ways that ground views, however spectacular, cannot achieve because of the inherent limitations of human visual field and the obstruction created by spray. The gorge system below the falls, that complex of zigzagging canyons carved by previous positions of the waterfall, becomes legible from above, becomes a pattern you can read, a story written in stone that traces the fall's retreat over hundreds of thousands of years. Each turn in the gorge marks a previous position. Each straight section follows a different fracture, the entire sequence documenting the geological history of this place, showing how erosion proceeds, how waterfalls migrate upstream, how the landscape is transformed over time by the patient work of flowing water exploiting weaknesses in resistant rock. The spray column, that vast rising mass of moisture that creates Mosi-oa-Tunya's smoke, is perhaps even more impressive from above than from below, rising hundreds of meters into the air, creating a permanent cloud that drifts with the wind, that catches sunlight and creates rainbows, that marks the fall's location from extraordinary distances. From the helicopter, you can see the spray from all angles, can watch it rise from the chasm and climb into the atmosphere, can see how it spreads and dissipates, can understand its scale in ways that are impossible when you are within it, being soaked by it, experiencing it as rain rather than observing it as phenomenon. The rainforest created by the spray, that narrow band of lush vegetation clinging to the cliffs and extending back from the falls as far as the moisture reaches, shows clearly from above as a distinct zone of greener, denser vegetation, contrasting sharply with the surrounding drier woodland.
This visual boundary marks the extent of the fall's hydrological influence, shows how far the spray travels and deposits moisture, demonstrates how the falls create their own microclimate, how they modify the environment for hundreds of meters around their immediate location, how they make possible ecosystems that could not otherwise exist in this region. The relationship between the falls and the river becomes clear from above in ways that are confusing from ground level. You can see the broad, placid Zambezi approaching the falls from upstream, see how it narrows slightly as it nears the precipice, see the moment of the plunge and the spray it creates, see the narrow gorge into which the water descends, see how the river emerges from the gorge downstream and gradually widens again, returning to something resembling its upstream character, though now flowing through different terrain, constrained by different geology, carrying the memory of its spectacular descent in its chemistry and its energy. The microlight offers a different flying experience, slower and lower and more intimate than the helicopter, open to the air and the spray, quieter in operation, more like flying than like riding in an aircraft, more visceral and less mediated. The microlight is essentially a hang glider with an engine, a minimal aircraft that puts you directly in the environment rather than observing it through windows, that requires accepting exposure and vulnerability in exchange for the immediacy and intensity of the experience. Not everyone is comfortable in a microlight. The open cockpit and minimal structure and proximity to the elements can be frightening for those accustomed to enclosed aircraft. But for those who embrace it, the experience offers something closer to bird flight than to conventional aviation, offers a way of experiencing the falls from above that feels more integrated with the environment, more participatory, less touristic. Both helicopters and microlights have been controversial at Victoria Falls, criticized for the noise they generate, for the intrusion they represent into what should perhaps be primarily a natural soundscape, for the disruption they cause to wildlife, for the class divisions they represent between tourists who can afford these expensive flights and those who cannot. These criticisms have merit, raise legitimate questions about appropriate uses of natural wonders, about whether some experiences should be restricted or prohibited to preserve the character and ecological integrity of special places, about whose interests should be prioritized when commercial opportunities conflict with conservation values or with equitable access.
But the flights also provide access to perspectives that are otherwise unavailable. They contribute to understanding and appreciation in ways that ground-based visitation cannot, that create awareness and support for conservation among people who might not otherwise engage deeply with the falls, that generate economic benefits that flow to local communities and conservation efforts. The balance between these considerations is not simple, requires weighing competing values and interests, requires acknowledging that there are trade-offs involved in any decision about how natural wonders should be accessed and experienced and managed. The view from above, however it is obtained, whether through helicopter or microlight, or even from aerial photographs taken by others, changes how you understand Victoria Falls, adds dimensions to your mental model of the place, provides context that enriches all subsequent ground-level experiences. After seeing the falls from above, returning to the cliff-edge viewpoints or descending into the gorges, you carry with you the aerial perspective, the knowledge of how the parts fit together, the understanding of the larger pattern within which each individual viewpoint and experience is situated. This enriched understanding does not diminish the ground-level experiences, but enhances them, allows you to locate yourself mentally within the larger geography, to understand what you are seeing as part of a complex whole rather than as isolated fragments, to appreciate both the details and the overall structure, both the local and the regional, both the immediate sensation and the broader context. The ecosystem that exists within the constant spray zone, in that narrow band where moisture from the falls creates conditions found nowhere else for hundreds of kilometers, is a biological anomaly,
an island of tropical rainforest existing improbably in the midst of drier woodland, sustained entirely by the falls, entirely dependent on the continuous moisture that the plunging water generates, as vulnerable to changes in the river's flow as any organism could be to changes in its essential life support. The constant moisture, the year-round water availability, the moderated temperatures that result from evaporative cooling in the spray, all combine to create conditions that certain plants require, that certain animals depend on, that certain ecological relationships demand. Species that are normally found only in higher rainfall regions, only in truly tropical environments, exist here in this isolated pocket, this fragment of rainforest maintained not by rainfall from clouds, but by rainfall from waterfalls, not by climate, but by the local hydrological phenomenon that creates its own weather, its own moisture regime, its own small world of wetness in a landscape that is otherwise seasonal, that experiences months of dryness when rain does not fall and rivers run low. The vegetation in the spray zone is lush and layered, creates a canopy and an understory, supports epiphytes and vines, shows the structural complexity characteristic of tropical forests, all compressed into a narrow band that extends only as far as the spray regularly reaches, that terminates abruptly at the boundary where moisture becomes insufficient to support these demanding species. The transition from rainforest to woodland is sharp, often visible as a clear line, a botanical boundary that marks the physical limit of the fall's influence, that demonstrates how local features can create microclimates, how topography and hydrology interact to produce environmental heterogeneity, how biodiversity accumulates in the spaces where different conditions meet and create opportunities for species that can exploit the boundaries. Ferns dominate portions of the spray zone, their fronds unfurling in the constant moisture, their spores dispersing in the wet air, their physiology perfectly suited to these conditions of high humidity and moderate light and perpetual wetness. Tree ferns, species normally associated with mountain forests or tropical highlands, exist here at relatively low elevation, thriving in the spray, growing to substantial sizes, creating a Jurassic appearance, a sense of ancient forests, of time before flowering plants dominated the landscape. These ferns are relicts in some sense, survivors from earlier geological periods when ferns were more widespread, now restricted to special environments like this spray zone where conditions favor their particular adaptations and requirements. Mosses and liverworts coat rocks and tree trunks, create green carpets on the ground, absorb moisture directly from the air, thrive in the saturated atmosphere that the spray maintains. These primitive plants, lacking the vascular systems and complex structures of more advanced species, are nevertheless perfectly adapted to this environment, can survive conditions that would desiccate more complex plants, can photosynthesize in low light, can contribute to nutrient cycling and soil formation in ways that support the larger ecosystem. Flowering plants adapted to wet conditions flourish here, producing blooms that attract pollinators, creating visual displays that add color to the green abundance, participating in the complex web of relationships that characterize healthy ecosystems. Some of these species are endemic, found only in this spray zone or in similar but rare environments elsewhere in the region, having evolved in isolation, having been shaped by these specific conditions over thousands of generations, representing unique genetic lineages that exist nowhere else on Earth, that would be lost forever if this spray zone were destroyed or significantly altered. The insects in the spray zone are abundant and diverse, reflecting the productivity that moisture and vegetation create, providing food for birds and other insectivores, serving as pollinators and decomposers and prey, filling every available ecological niche with species adapted to these particular conditions. Butterflies of species normally found only in rainforest environments flutter through the spray zone, their wings iridescent in the filtered light, their caterpillars feeding on the lush vegetation, their entire life cycles dependent on the moisture and the plant diversity that the spray maintains.
Birds are perhaps the most visible animals in the spray zone, attracted by the insects and the fruits and the nesting sites that the dense vegetation provides, creating a constant activity of feeding and singing and territorial displays, creating soundscapes that complement the visual richness of the environment. Some bird species are found only in or around the spray zone, are endemic to this microenvironment, have evolved in ways that tie them specifically to these conditions, making them vulnerable to any changes in the fall's behavior, to any reduction in flow that would decrease the spray and reduce the extent of suitable habitat. The spray zone serves as refugium, as ark, as isolated fragment of habitat that preserves species and communities that might otherwise be lost from the region, that provides insurance against the broader landscape transformations that human activity and climate change are creating, that maintains biodiversity even as surrounding environments are simplified and degraded. This refugial function makes the spray zone disproportionately important from a conservation perspective, makes protecting it and the falls that create it essential not just for tourism or aesthetics, but for biological preservation, for maintaining the full spectrum of regional biodiversity, for ensuring that future generations have access to the full richness of species and ecosystems that characterize this part of Africa. But the spray zone is also vulnerable. More vulnerable than its permanent appearance might suggest, entirely dependent on the falls maintaining their current flow patterns, on the Zambezi delivering sufficient water to create the spray that sustains the ecosystem, on climate remaining stable enough that rainfall patterns in the upper basin continue to feed the river adequately. Any significant long-term reduction in flow, any permanent shift toward drier conditions would shrink the spray zone, would reduce the area of suitable habitat, would stress and potentially eliminate the species that depend on these conditions, would transform this unique ecosystem into something simpler, poorer, less diverse. The 2019 drought provided a preview of what extended dry conditions might mean for the spray zone, reduced the falls to minimal flow, created conditions where spray was dramatically reduced, where moisture availability declined significantly, where plants accustomed to constant wetness experienced stress, where the ecosystem was tested in ways it had not been tested in living memory. Most species survived, the drought was temporary, normal flows eventually returned and the spray zone recovered. But the experience demonstrated vulnerability, showed that these ecosystems exist in a delicate balance, that they are not infinitely resilient, that there are limits to how much stress they can absorb before fundamental transformations occur, before communities disintegrate and species disappear, and the unique character of the place is lost. The Devil's Pool exists only during low water, only when the flow over the falls has diminished to levels that allow the natural rock barrier at the edge of the precipice to emerge, to become visible above the waterline, to create a pool where swimming is possible without being swept over the falls, without being carried by the current into the abyss that drops 100 meters to the churning water below. During high water, the Devil's Pool is submerged, the rock barrier invisible beneath the flood, the entire area a torrent that would carry away anything that entered it, that offers no possibility of safe swimming, no chance of survival if you were foolish enough to venture into the current. But during low water, typically from September to December, the pool becomes accessible, becomes a destination for those seeking the ultimate thrill, the opportunity to swim to the very edge of Victoria Falls, to peer over the precipice while being held back from the drop only by the rock lip that forms the pool's edge, by a natural barrier that is reliable but not infallible, that has held for centuries but that could theoretically fail, that requires trust in geology and in the guides who have made this swim countless times and who know where the currents are safe and where they become dangerous. The approach to the Devil's Pool begins on Livingstone Island, a small piece of land on the Zambian side of the falls, accessible by boat when water levels permit, serving as staging area and briefing location for those who have decided to make the swim. The guides who lead these swims are experienced, know the river intimately, understand where the safe routes are and where the dangerous currents lurk, can read the water in ways that visitors cannot, can assess conditions and make judgments about whether swimming is safe on any particular day, whether individual swimmers have the strength and the nerve to make the journey. The briefing is serious, emphasizes the dangers, requires acknowledgement that this is an inherently risky activity, that people have died in the Zambezi, that although the Devil's Pool itself has a good safety record, the approach to it and the water around it are genuinely hazardous, demand respect and careful attention and exact adherence to the guide's instructions. Some people decide at this point not to proceed, recognize that the risk exceeds their tolerance, that the thrill is not worth the danger, that there are other ways to experience the falls that do not require betting your life on your swimming ability and the reliability of natural rock formations.
But those who proceed, who commit to the swim, are led into the water upstream of the pool, entering the Zambezi above the falls, feeling the current immediately, understanding viscerally that this river is powerful, that it is flowing toward the precipice, that the only thing between you and a fatal plunge is the guide's knowledge and your own ability to follow instructions, and the rock barrier that creates the pool. The swim across the current requires strength and technique, requires angling upstream to compensate for the downstream flow, requires constant attention to the guides who position themselves to catch swimmers who are struggling, who can assess when someone is in trouble and intervene before the situation becomes critical. Reaching the pool itself, pulling yourself up onto the rock ledge that forms its upstream boundary, you are suddenly in relatively calm water, protected from the main current by the rocks, able to relax slightly, though never completely, never entirely forgetting that you are meters from the edge, that the drop is waiting, that this is fundamentally a dangerous place despite the apparent calm. Other swimmers are already in the pool, some tentatively approaching the edge, some retreating from it, some lying on their backs looking up at the sky, trying to ignore the proximity of the precipice. Moving toward the edge of the Devil's Pool, swimming or crawling across the submerged rocks, you feel the current increasing slightly, feel the water trying to pull you forward, feel the edge approaching both physically and psychologically, the point beyond which there is no return, beyond which the water accelerates and flows over the lip and begins its 100-meter fall. The guides position themselves at the pool's edge, create a human barrier, grab swimmers who approach and prevent them from going too far, from crossing the invisible line beyond which the current becomes too strong, beyond which even strong swimmers would be helpless. And then you are at the edge, looking over, seeing the drop, understanding in a way that no photograph or description can convey what it means for water to fall this distance, what kind of void exists beneath you, what would happen if the rock barrier failed, or if you miscalculated and went beyond the point where the guides can reach you. The water flowing over the edge is surprisingly calm, almost gentle-looking, belying its lethal potential, flowing smoothly over the lip and into space, accelerating as it falls, transforming from the relatively placid flow at the edge into the violent chaos of the plunge and impact far below. The view from the Devil's Pool is unique, offers a perspective on the falls that is available nowhere else, that combines the ground-level immediacy of being in the water with the aerial overview of seeing across the width of the falls, that creates an experience of simultaneous danger and beauty, of terror and exhilaration, of being simultaneously threatened and awed. You are in the river, in the water that is about to plunge over the falls, participating in the flow rather than merely observing it, feeling the current and the temperature and the power in ways that spectators on the cliff cannot, experiencing the falls from within rather than from without. The temptation to look down, to peer over the edge and see the full extent of the drop is strong and frightening simultaneously, creates a kind of vertigo that is physical and psychological at once, that makes your stomach drop and your muscles tense and your grip on the rock tighten involuntarily. Looking down, you see the cliff face, see the water falling beside you, see the spray rising from below, see the rainbow that forms in the mist, see far below the churning pool where the falling water strikes and creates chaos. The distance seems impossible, seems too far to fall and survive, seems like a gap between worlds, between life and death, between the solid ground of existence and the void of extinction. Some people cannot bring themselves to look,
cannot approach the edge closely enough to peer over, find that fear overrides curiosity, that self-preservation trumps the desire for experience. This is not cowardice, but reasonable prudence, appropriate response to genuine danger, recognition that some experiences come with costs that may not be worth paying, that thrills are not always worth the risks, that wisdom sometimes consists of acknowledging limits and respecting them rather than pushing past them in pursuit of bragging rights or photographs. But those who do look, who manage to overcome the fear enough to approach the edge and peer down, who experience that moment of simultaneous terror and wonder, carry the memory permanently, describe it as one of the most intense experiences of their lives, compare it to nothing else because nothing else offers quite this combination of beauty and danger, of natural wonder and human vulnerability, of being in a place where the line between safety and disaster is measured in inches, where small changes in position or current could determine whether you return safely to shore or become another cautionary tale about the Zambezi's power and the folly of underestimating it. The swim back from the Devil's Pool, returning to shore after the experience, feels different from the swim out, feels like a return to safety, a retreat from the edge, a movement back toward the world of normal risks and ordinary dangers. The same distance that felt thrilling on the approach feels merely tiring on the return. The current that added excitement now just creates work. The guides who seemed like facilitators of adventure now seem like rescuers, like the people who have brought you safely through something genuinely dangerous and now are delivering you back to solid ground and the world where death by waterfall is not an immediate possibility. On shore, wrapped in towels, the adrenaline gradually subsiding, you process what you just experienced, compare notes with other swimmers, look back at the Devil's Pool and the falls, and try to reconcile the memory of being there with the visual evidence of where you were, the gap between perception and reality that extreme experiences often create. Photographs are taken, proof that you did this, evidence that you swam to the edge of Victoria Falls, that you looked over and returned, that you engaged with this place in ways that most visitors do not, that you earned a different kind of story to tell, a different kind of memory to carry.
But the experience also raises questions, ethical and practical, about whether this kind of activity is appropriate, whether encouraging people to swim at the edge of a waterfall represents responsible tourism or reckless endangerment, whether the economic benefits and the personal thrills justify the risks and the environmental impacts, whether there are some experiences that should perhaps remain imagined rather than actualized, some boundaries that should be respected rather than transgressed. These questions have no simple answers, depend on values and perspectives that differ between individuals and cultures, that cannot be resolved through appeal to facts alone, but require weighing competing considerations and making judgments about acceptable risks and appropriate uses of natural wonders. Victoria Falls Bridge spans the Batoka Gorge just below the falls, a steel arch that crosses the chasm in a single leap, connecting Zambia and Zimbabwe, linking what were once northern and southern Rhodesia, continuing to serve as international crossing point more than a century after its construction, still carrying trains and vehicles and pedestrians across the gap where the Zambezi has carved its canyon, still standing as testament to early 20th century engineering ambition and colonial infrastructure development. The bridge was completed in 1905, built under the direction of George Imbo, designed to Cecil Rhodes' specification that trains crossing it should be enveloped in the spray from the falls, should pass through the mist that gives Mosi-oa-Tunya its name, should experience the falls intimately rather than merely viewing them from a distance. The construction of the bridge was itself an epic undertaking, requiring the transportation of materials and equipment to a remote location, requiring workers to operate at heights and under conditions that made every task dangerous, requiring engineering solutions to problems that had no precedence in this landscape. The bridge's arch spans 198 meters, rising 128 meters above the low water level of the river, creating a structure that is both functional infrastructure and spectacular landmark,
that serves practical purposes while also contributing to the scenic grandeur of the area that is both tool and monument. The location was chosen carefully, close enough to the falls to experience their spray and their presence, far enough downstream to avoid the most intense turbulence and the most unstable geology, positioned where the gorge walls could provide solid anchorage for the bridge's abutments, where the span was manageable given the technology available, where the approaches from both sides could be constructed without excessive difficulty. The result is a bridge that seems almost perfectly positioned, that complements rather than competes with the falls, that enhances the experience of visiting the area rather than detracting from it, that has become as much a part of the Victoria Falls landscape as the falls themselves. Today, the bridge serves multiple purposes beyond its original function as railway crossing. It carries road traffic connecting the two countries, facilitating commerce and tourism, allowing movement between the two sides of the falls and the two nations they divide. It serves as viewing platform, with pedestrian walkways allowing visitors to walk onto the bridge and look down at the gorge and upstream toward the falls, providing perspectives that are unique, that show the relationship between the falls and the canyon in ways that other viewpoints cannot. And most spectacularly, it serves as bungee jumping platform, with operators running commercial jumps from the bridge's center, sending people into free fall toward the river 111 meters below, creating thrills that are perhaps even more intense than those offered by the Devil's Pool, though in different ways, through different combinations of fear and exultation and the peculiar psychology of deliberately stepping off a bridge and trusting an elastic cord to save you from impact with the rocks and water below. The bungee jumping from Victoria Falls Bridge has become world famous, draws thrill seekers from around the globe, offers what is marketed as one of the world's highest commercial bungee jumps, combines the height and the setting and the proximity to the falls into an experience that is difficult to match elsewhere. The jump itself is pure adrenaline, pure terror and exultation, the moment of stepping off the platform and committing to the fall, the seconds of free fall before the cord catches, the rebound and the oscillations that follow, the gradual settling as the elastic stretches and contracts and eventually brings you to rest dangling above the river, still high enough that rescue requires being pulled back up to the bridge, still far enough from the ground that the sense of exposure and vulnerability remains intense. Not everyone who visits the bridge makes the jump. Many are content to watch others, to experience vicariously the courage or foolishness required to step off, to observe the reactions of jumpers both before and after, to admire or question the willingness to pay for such an intense burst of fear and adrenaline. The watchers create an audience, their presence adding a performative element to the jump, making it not just personal experience but public spectacle, creating a social dimension that amplifies the psychological intensity, that adds the pressure of audience expectation to the inherent stress of the jump itself. The bridge is also contested space, represents different things to different constituencies, carries different meanings depending on historical perspective and political orientation. For some, it is a triumph of engineering, a demonstration of what human ingenuity can accomplish, a celebration of the colonial-era ambitions that drove infrastructure development across Africa. For others, it is symbol of colonialism itself, represents the imposition of European control and European purposes on African landscapes, stands for the exploitation and appropriation that characterized the colonial period, requires critical engagement rather than uncomplicated celebration. For still others, it is simply functional infrastructure, a useful bridge that facilitates movement and commerce, that serves contemporary needs regardless of its historical origins, that should be judged primarily on its current utility rather than on the circumstances of its creation.
These competing meanings coexist, create complexity and tension, make the bridge more than merely physical structure, turn it into symbol and statement, into something that carries weight beyond its engineering function.
Walking across the bridge, standing at its center and looking down at the gorge, you are standing in history, standing at the intersection of multiple narratives about colonialism and development, about appropriate uses of natural wonders, about who has the right to build and modify and claim landscapes, about how we should understand and relate to structures that are simultaneously engineering achievements and historical artifacts, simultaneously useful infrastructure and problematic monuments. The trains that still occasionally cross the bridge, though less frequently than in earlier decades as rail transport has declined in importance, sound their whistles as they approach, announcing their presence to anyone on the bridge, warning pedestrians to clear the tracks, creating moments of drama as the train emerges from the approach cutting and makes its way across the span, the cars swaying slightly on the curves, the passengers visible through windows looking out at the falls and the gorge, experiencing something of what Cecil Rhodes imagined when he specified that trains should pass through the spray, should engage with the falls rather than merely passing near them. The bridge at night takes on a different character, is illuminated by lights that pick out its structure, that create a glowing arc across the darkness of the gorge, that is visible from the fall's viewpoints and from the surrounding area, that transforms the bridge from daytime infrastructure into nighttime spectacle, into a feature that contributes to the overall impression of the falls area as a place where human and natural grandeur coexist, where engineering and geology create a complex landscape that is richer for containing both, that demonstrates human capacity for achievement while also reminding us that our greatest structures are small compared to the forces that carved these gorges, that our most impressive engineering is modest compared to the work that water has done here over hundreds of thousands of years. The peoples who have lived along the Zambezi and around Victoria Falls for generations before colonial contact, before European arrival and naming and mapping, possess knowledge that is deeper and more nuanced than what can be learned from brief visits or scientific studies, knowledge accumulated through long experience, passed down through oral traditions, embedded in practices and stories, and the everyday engagement with landscape that characterizes indigenous relationships with place. This knowledge is not merely historical curiosity, not simply interesting background to the main story of the falls, but is living tradition, continuing relationship, ongoing engagement that deserves recognition and respect and incorporation into how we understand and manage and present Victoria Falls to the world. The Tonga people, whose traditional territories include the lands around and above the falls, have known the Zambezi intimately for centuries, have developed practices adapted to the river's seasonal rhythms, have learned which areas flood and which remain safe during high water, where the best fishing occurs at different times of year, how to read the river's moods and behaviors, how to use its resources sustainably while respecting its power. Their knowledge is practical and spiritual simultaneously, does not separate the pragmatic from the sacred in the ways that Western thought often does, treats the river and the falls as simultaneously resource and mystery, as something to be used and something to be revered. The stories that have been passed down through generations contain ecological knowledge encoded in narrative form, warnings about dangerous areas presented as accounts of what happened to those who ignored earlier warnings, information about seasonal patterns presented as explanations for why certain ceremonies occur at certain times. These stories are not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated knowledge systems, ways of storing and transmitting information in societies without written records, ways of ensuring that each generation learns what previous generations discovered, ways of maintaining continuity of understanding across spans of time that exceed individual memory. The relationship between the Tonga people and the falls was disrupted by colonial interventions, by the establishment of national parks and the restrictions on traditional uses, by the development of tourism infrastructure that often failed to include or benefit local communities, by the general pattern of colonialism where indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their lands and excluded from decision-making about how those lands should be managed and used. The post-colonial period has brought some corrections to these injustices, some recognition of indigenous rights and traditional knowledge, some attempts to involve local communities in management and to ensure that they benefit from tourism revenue. But these corrections are incomplete, remain contested, continue to be subjects of negotiation and sometimes conflict between different stakeholders with different interests and different visions of how Victoria Falls should be understood and managed. The sacred sites around the falls, the locations where ceremonies were performed and offerings made, where the spiritual dimension of the place was acknowledged and honored, have often been disrespected or ignored in the development of tourism infrastructure, have been treated as obstacles to be worked around rather than as central features deserving protection and reverence. Some of these sites have been incorporated into tourism, have become stops on guided tours, have been explained to visitors in ways that may or may not accurately represent their significance, that may reduce complex spiritual traditions to simple sound bites appropriate for tourist consumption. Other sites remain known only to local communities, are deliberately kept private, protected from tourist intrusion not through official designation but through simple non-disclosure, through the decision not to share certain information, not to make certain places accessible to outsiders.
The elders who carry traditional knowledge about the falls, about the stories and the practices and the proper ways of engaging with this place, are aging, as elders always are, and the question of transmission becomes urgent. Will the younger generation learn these traditions, maintain these relationships, continue the practices that have connected people to place for centuries? Or will the pull of modern life, the attractions of urban areas and formal education and global culture create gaps in transmission, create a situation where traditional knowledge is lost, where the connections between people and place are severed, where the falls become merely scenic attraction rather than living element of ongoing indigenous cultures? These questions matter not just for cultural preservation in abstract sense, but for the practical management of the falls and the surrounding area, for making decisions about conservation and development, about how to balance competing interests and values, about whose voices should be heard and whose perspectives should shape policy. Indigenous knowledge about the fall's ecology, about the species that live in the spray zone and the gorges, about the seasonal patterns and the long-term changes that have occurred over generations of observation, represents data that scientific studies can complement but cannot replace, represents understanding that comes from different ways of knowing, from different relationships with landscape, from different priorities and concerns than those that drive academic research or tourism development. The collaboration between indigenous communities and scientists, when it occurs respectfully and equitably, can produce better understanding and better management than either approach alone could achieve. Indigenous knowledge about what has changed over time, about what patterns used to be normal and what represents departure from historical norms, provides baselines and context that ecological monitoring requires. Scientific methods for measuring and analyzing and predicting can test and extend and formalize the observations that indigenous knowledge provides. Together, these approaches can create more complete understanding, can identify problems earlier and respond more effectively, can ensure that management decisions are informed by multiple sources of knowledge and multiple perspectives on what matters and why. But collaboration requires more than just incorporating indigenous knowledge into scientific frameworks, requires actually sharing power and decision-making, requires ensuring that indigenous communities benefit economically from tourism and conservation, requires respecting traditional practices even when they conflict with standard management approaches, requires acknowledging that indigenous peoples have rights to their traditional lands and to participation in determining how those lands are used, rights that persist regardless of colonial history, rights that are increasingly recognized in international law and human rights frameworks, even if implementation remains incomplete and contested. The future of Victoria Falls, at least the future of how humans relate to and manage the falls, will be shaped significantly by how successfully these issues of indigenous rights and knowledge and participation are addressed, by whether post-colonial Africa can develop models of conservation and tourism that benefit local communities and respect traditional cultures, or whether the colonial patterns of exclusion and exploitation will persist under new labels and new justifications.
The falls themselves will continue regardless, will keep falling and carving and creating spray, will follow the inexorable logic of water and gravity and erosion, will be what they are regardless of human decisions about management and access and naming. But the human story of the falls, the social and cultural and economic dimensions of this place, will be determined by how successfully we navigate these challenges, how wisely we make decisions about competing values and interests, how honestly we confront the legacies of colonialism and work toward futures that are more just, more inclusive, more respectful of the full range of human relationships with this extraordinary place. The edge between water and air, between horizontal flow and vertical fall, between the Zambezi River and the Zambezi Waterfall, is a threshold that marks transformation, a boundary where one state of being gives way to another, where continuity is interrupted and a new phase begins. Standing at this edge, looking out across the brink where water flows smoothly toward the precipice, you are witnessing the moment before the plunge, the calm before the violence, the instant when the water has committed to falling but has not yet begun to accelerate, has not yet transformed from river into cascade, from placid flow into spectacular descent. This edge is not absolute, not a perfectly defined line, but a transition zone where velocity increases gradually, where the riverbed slopes downward before dropping away completely, where the water begins to accelerate before the cliff reveals itself, where the transformation from horizontal to vertical is anticipated by the water's movement, by the increasing speed and the compression of flow as the width narrows approaching the falls. Watching the water approach this edge, you can almost see it recognize what is coming, can project onto its movement a kind of awareness, a knowledge of the precipice ahead, though of course the water knows nothing, simply responds to gravity and topography, simply flows where the gradient takes it, simply follows the path of least resistance until resistance drops to zero and falling becomes inevitable.
The sound changes at the edge. The roar of the falls proper begins to mix with the rush of water accelerating toward the brink, creates an anticipatory quality, a sense that the thunder you are hearing includes both the impact far below and the approach from upstream, both the result and the cause, both the fall already occurring and the fall about to occur. This doubled sound, this temporal complexity in the auditory experience, contributes to the disorienting effect of being close to the falls, to the sense that normal sequential time is somehow suspended here, that past and present and future are all occurring simultaneously in the eternal now of the falling water. The spray that rises from below reaches the edge, crosses back over the brink, creates a situation where water that has already fallen is returning as mist, is ascending while other water is descending, is violating the normal rules about gravity and downward flow, is demonstrating that the falls create their own local weather, their own microphysics where unusual things become normal, where water travels in all directions simultaneously, where up and down become temporarily confused in the turbulence and the spray and the complex air movements that the falling water creates. Standing at this edge, you are as close to the falls as you can be without actually being in them, without becoming part of what is falling, without crossing the threshold from observer to participant in ways that would be fatal. The temptation to approach closer, to see just a bit more, to lean out just a bit further, is real and dangerous, reflects the curious human tendency to push limits, to test boundaries, to see how close we can get to danger without quite crossing into actual harm. People die at waterfalls, slip on wet rocks or lean too far or misjudge distances, become statistics rather than survivors, become warnings rather than adventurers, become part of the fall's history in ways they did not intend and their families do not want. The barriers and fences that have been installed at certain viewpoints along the falls are responses to these deaths, attempts to keep people safe despite themselves, to impose external limits when judgment fails, to create physical obstacles that prevent the approach to the actual edge where mistakes become fatal.
These barriers are often criticized as intrusive, as limiting access, as reducing the authenticity of the experience by mediating between visitors and falls, by inserting human infrastructure between humans and nature. But they are also necessary, are responses to demonstrated need, to the reality that people make poor decisions, that thrills and photographs are not worth dying for, that some protection from our own impulses is appropriate and valuable. Yet even with barriers, the edge remains powerful, remains compelling, remains a place that draws the eye and the imagination and the body's unconscious desire to approach, to experience directly, to get as close as possible to the transformation that is occurring, to the threshold between states, to the moment when water stops being river and starts being waterfall. This edge is liminal space, is boundary between categories, is place where definitions become fluid and transformations occur, where what something is gives way to what it is becoming, where stability is revealed as temporary condition, where change is shown to be the only constant, where the falls demonstrate that everything flows, that nothing remains static, that transformation is fundamental to existence. The philosophical dimension of Victoria Falls, the way it invites contemplation about impermanence and power and beauty and danger, about humanity's place in natural systems and our proper relationship with landscapes that exceed our scale and our control, is perhaps as important as the visual and auditory spectacle, perhaps as worthy of attention as the statistics about height and volume and the geological explanations about basalt fractures and erosion patterns. The falls teach without intending to teach, demonstrate without trying to demonstrate, simply by being what they are, by doing what they do, by falling and creating mist and thunder and rainbows, by carving gorges and supporting ecosystems and killing those who approach carelessly, by existing as one of Earth's great wonders, one of the places where natural forces operate at scales that demand recognition, that command respect, that inspire awe in the original sense of that word, as mixture of fear and reverence, of attraction and repulsion, of desire to approach and wisdom to maintain distance. The water at the edge continues its eternal movement toward the precipice, moment after moment, hour after hour, day and night, season after season, carrying with it the entire Zambezi's flow, representing the accumulation of rain that has fallen across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, concentrated into this moment of descent, into this transformation from river into waterfall, into this spectacular display of what happens when gravity and volume and geology align, when conditions combine to create something that exceeds normal experience, that rises to the level of wonder, that deserves to be witnessed and protected and understood as fully as our limited human capacities allow, as one of the places where the planet reveals its power, where nature demonstrates its capacity to create beauty and terror simultaneously, where we are reminded of our smallness and our brief tenure on a world that will continue its processes long after we are gone, that will keep making waterfalls and carving gorges and transforming landscapes according to laws that operate independent of human presence or human preference, that simply are what they are, doing what they do, being what they must be, magnificent and indifferent, spectacular and unconcerned, falling forever toward a future that no one can prevent and that everyone who sees it will remember for as long as they live.